Art Travelogues are episodes where I travel to see an artwork or an exhibition. I describe my journey, always informed by what I'm about to see, what I know, what I do not know, within this very particular configuration of my movement in time and space with art as a destination. This inaugural episode of the series is brought to you as a summer special episode and is dedicated to a commissioned artwork by British artist Haroon Mirza, who often works collaboratively by creating a small community of very talented people around a multifaceted project. Sound, light, invisible energies made tangible, technology, and the vehicle of our beliefs and faiths are elements at the heart of his work. Artists often elaborate open questions which stimulate a complex experience of embodied musing. This is what I try to share with a mix of writing, sound, and images for those watching on YouTube or Spotify, and interviews with some of the people involved, including the artist. This new commission is part of an exhibition titled In Other Worlds, Acts of Translation at Focal Point Gallery in Southend-on-Sea, with works from the David and Indra Roberts collection. The show was conceived by in-house curator Inês Costa and Yates Norton, curator at the Roberts Institute of Art. It has works by established but fascinating artists such as Louise Bourgeois, Anthony Tapies, a beautiful Frank Auerbach, a precious, beautiful small painting by Miriam Kann, and a very, very surprising painting by George Kondo, as well as mid-career artists equally fascinating such as Francesca Mollett, Charles Avery, Neil Belufa, Mark Bradford, and a quite incredible artwork by Dan Vaux, which is two sculptures, one medieval, the other one probably 2,000 years old, ensconced in one another. One is obviously Madonna, and the other one a young male, naked. The monstrous shape that is presented to you, the wood of the Madonna, is eaten up by time and probably bugs. And the whole thing is held by this very precisely produced strip of metal that accompanies the shape of the sculptures and holds them. It is, in some ways, a very good image of what this episode is, because it really encapsulates this monstrous creature that is our culture, across times, across geographies, across faiths, and across rebellions as well. And I absolutely loved it. So, in the same room, you will have every 15 minutes as well the piece that Haroon Mirza produced for the exhibition and that I watched as a performance on the 5th of July of this year, 2025, which is called Adam, Eve, Others, and a UFO for Choral Octet. It plays every 15 minutes. The exhibition is really worth the trip, I can tell you that. And the trip is very pleasant, as you will find out. So this is Exhibitionistas. If you're new here, I'm Joana P. Neves, contemporary art curator and writer, and I'll be your host for the next 40 minutes or so. You will also hear other voices which will complement or expand my own perspective of the exhibition and the particular performance and piece that I will be focusing on. And this is the first Art Travelogue episode at Focal Point Gallery. Enjoy. The destination, Southend-on-Sea. Sounds distant, but it's barely an hour away from London. As usual, Before leaving, I check the journey. I look online for information about the area. You go to Fenchurch Street Station or Liverpool Station in East London, and you take the railway train straight to your destination. You journey in a straight line while the Thames snakes along eastward onto the marshes north of the estuary where the river meets the North Sea. I know that if I were to continue east, if my train floated away in the same direction, crossing the waters, soon enough I'd leave the United Kingdom behind and reach the shores of the Netherlands. This is where my mind goes when I set off towards the shore, any shore, especially because here, on paper, everything draws attention to it. The very literal name, southend-on-sea, where the northern lands stop by the blue, green and brown width of the delta. Then there's the name of the gallery, Focal Point, aptly named for a cultural space. The focal point is the focus of attention, but it's also the point to which light and sound waves converge, modulated by sunsets and sunrises, solstices and equinoxes, winds and tides, washing over tidal creeks, salt marshes and mudflats. The website Focal Point Gallery has an unusual piece of information at the bottom of the page. Tide times: low tide 3:20 a.m. and then 4:01 p.m. and high tide 9:48 a.m. and then 10:13 p.m. The riverscape is quite dramatic. It expands and withdraws. But the gallery doesn't face the sea. It's closer to Southend Victoria train station, whose line runs along the beaches, leading you into this atypical seaside town. The gallery is nestled between the station and the high street, leading to the, quote, world's longest pleasure pier, unquote. Waves of light, of sound, were perhaps of notice because I'm going to Southend to watch a performance, part of British artist Haroon Mirza's new commission for the current group exhibition at the gallery, and if anything has moved him, it's the alchemy of sound and light and their technologies, from prayer bowls to speakers, mixing tables, LED contraptions to cables. When I asked him if he could pinpoint the moment when he was drawn to the relation between sound and a visual or light element, he remembered the parties his family organized with musicians, but he also recalled another far more intriguing episode.
I was exposed to quite a lot of music as a kid, I guess, from particularly my dad. My parents used to throw qawwali parties, they'd invite musicians playing classical Indian music. I think I can pinpoint where I had this desire for connecting the visual to the acoustic. So I remember very clearly as a kid, if we were traveling somewhere in the car and my dad was stopped at a red light and he'd have his indicator on to turn right, you can hear the sound of the indicator going tick, tick, tick. And I'd look for other cars that might be in sync with my dad's indicator to see if they're flashing at the same time. But it was very rare that it happened because all these indicators have different relay switches that tick at a different speed. So it was very rare that you'd get this synchronicity. But then when I did see it, it was like this kind of cool thing.
On the 5th of July, I'm not headed to Focal Point Gallery, but to Clifftown Theatre, which is where the performance is to take place. Art is always about the displacement of expectations to exactly where they should be. The Clifftown Theatre is an old church, and the performance is called Adam, Eve, Others, and a UFO for Choral Octet. I don't know yet that I'll be sitting in a hybrid performative space with the remnants of faith rituals welcoming another embodied experience of text and notation. Little do I know how appropriate this venue will turn out to be. I also learn in my research that Clifftown Centre is the famous drama school E15, with whom Haroon and his sound and music team collaborated. When you arrive at Southend-on-Sea, there is a big modern building seemingly abandoned, and you're greeted by the back of a brick edifice with giant letters announcing Odeon, a cinema most likely. I learned that Southend is far up in the list of areas with the highest population density in the UK, and it occurs to me that I didn't think about the people living there at all until we arrive, leave the station, and walk among the crowd toward the shore. The curator, Inês Costa, was attracted precisely to the demographics of the space and how history reflects them.
I'd say Essex is a land for experimentation. You know, you had like some of the first nudist colonies showed up in Essex. You had plot lands and this idea of people building their own houses. Alternative communities that would look like, there's a community called Othona, like communities that looked to like sort of, you know, be self-sustainable. So there is a history, there's many, many interesting histories. You know, like worker towns. The Bata factory was near Basildon. Basildon is a new town. So there's like all these kind of ebbs and flows of different kind of very radical ideas, very radical concepts that kind of brewed in Essex.
Inês told me that the idea most people have of Essex comes from the working class movement eastward to the factories and the cheaper housing, and which originated what was later labelled the Essex man, a sort of working class type with money but no taste. The term was created by the historian journalist Simon Heffer, who was from Essex himself, in an article for the Sunday Telegraph, published in the 90s, titled Mrs. Thatcher's Bruiser. It coined this new person, voting Conservative, young, industrious, mildly brutish. The female counterpart of the Essex man would be, Inês granted, a peroxide blonde with enhanced or altered features. Essex was labelled as the most misunderstood county of the UK, a phrase found on the gallery's website and elsewhere, whose origin I couldn't find, but seems to have been released into people's minds by the rehabilitating book Excellent Essex in Praise of England's Most Misunderstood County by Gillian Darley, published in 2019. No wonder such a book had to be written. Charles Dickens once described Chelmsford, the administrative capital of Essex, as, quote, the dullest and most stupid spot on the face of the earth, unquote. It is a white county, as white as the UK is, a little more perhaps, as soon as you step out of London. The population was, in the 2021 census, reported as being 87% white, less than over 90% a decade before. But diversity is not only based on ethnicity, as Inês suggested, it's also a history of radical change, artistic invention, and technological integration.
From the beginning, the idea was that we wanted to work with sound, because Southend, Essex, but Southend as well, have, you know, a very, very long history of music and sound and, you know, folk music and rock music. Depeche Mode are from Basildon and, you know, Echo Radio, which was, you know, producing most of the radios in the UK.
Indeed, walking in the streets of Southend, the population is urban. You see an emo kid here, normcore group there, a Caribbean family, quite a few blonde middle-aged women. The population you find in the outskirts of London once you move away from Hackney, Pinner, Woods Green. Southend is not as pretty as Chalkwell Beach right before or even Leigh-on-Sea, but there is an intriguing landscape of marshes, beaches, river and sea waters, not to mention the biodiversity of these protected areas. So the basis of this misunderstanding lies somewhere between what is lived, what is manifested through behavior, language, accent, and how it is perceived, truth being carried through between contexts. It's a question of translation within the same language, across different times and places, from the well-spoken journalist to remnants of Cockney, which now translate into the word girl being pronounced Gael. In 1998, an 18-year-old student from Essex was in the front pages of the newspaper for having been ridiculed by a Cambridge don at her interview for a place at Trinity College. Seeing a poem by T.S. Eliot with a line of Greek, the don told her, Being from Essex, you won't know what these funny squiggles are. The candidate left the interview in tears. In 1992, an Anglia University academic was commissioned to write a report about the media treatment of Essex people. Quote, "In exploring the stereotype, we discover more about the media than those it sought to depict." Unquote.
Language itself is translating itself continuously. How words change meaning, how they get used, how frequently they get used, so on and so forth, and how that corresponds to other languages. We're sort of always living in a sort of state of translation anyway.
The title of the exhibition at Focal Point Gallery is In Other Worlds, Acts of Translation. So far, either I'm influenced by the theme or it fits the Essex condition perfectly, probably both. As Haroon suggested, moving in the world is a process of constant translation and being translated. I also know that Adam, Eve, Others, and a UFO for Choral Octet, the performance piece I'm about to watch, is a translation of an earlier work from 2013 titled Adam, Eve, Others, and a UFO. What a strange idea, quite geeky when you think about it, to translate a work into another. Will I encounter an umbilical project? There is always a moment in translation where you're lost or afraid you might be. Adam, Eve, Others, and a UFO is a sonic and sculptural installation whose title involves the Abrahamic religions and their account of the creation. On the sixth day, God created humans. The UFO opens up other possible theories of creation, but also other concerns with technology. Who has it? Could others have it? And if so, would it be better than ours? The focal point between both myths is a suspicion that there may be a higher power hidden in the sky. This, I suppose, are concerns for some people and not at all for others. But they're the fabric of our dreams and nightmares, or perhaps not, as I find out in the train to Southend when I try to inspect my couple's relationship to higher planes. Do you consider yourself spiritual?
This is the service to Southend, Victoria.
Well, I don't
Next
think
station,
I
Wickford.
I know what spiritual means exactly for me. I think
In contradiction with this idea of the prevalence of religion, or perhaps reinforcing it, the origin of the title, it turns out, is the name of the devices used. There are 8 different speakers in what seems to be a 4-meter circle, one branded Adam, another Eve, and the others are, well, the others referred to in the title. All the speakers, Adam, Eve, and the others, are turned towards an LED contraption whose designation is UFO at the center, purchased from a certain Steve who sells them on his site bigprojects.org. It is the size and appearance of a bike light, with 8 LEDs displayed outward like a small sun. Each LED is connected to a speaker whose electric current either makes it flash, dims it, or brightens it, and is audible through speakers in patterns programmed by Haroon. The disposition of these almost anthropomorphic speakers toward the centralized power unnerves me. It itches right there where I stock memories of the panopticon, the circular structures conceived by Jeremy Bentham for architectures whose sole purpose is to express surveillance and powerlessness. However, here, the UFO's invisible energy is manifested through music. Electricity is made audible and rhythmic. This may be, after all, about interpretation beyond language, beyond perhaps dogma. Undoubtedly, the work holds both symbols, as usual in Haroon's work. But maybe there is no symbol. The speakers aren't people, they're technology receiving and distributing energy. Outside of this organized system is, after all, the creator, the artist, Haroon, and often a team of collaborators, another organized system, not a unique god, but a composer in the sense of detecting a tangible energy, receiving it, and delivering it in an organized form.
The thing with the shaman is I don't see shamanic, like shamanism as a practice, any different to what a scientist does or what an artist does. Certainly an artist, right? I mean, there's lots of commentators and scholars that talk about contemporary art being like a modern day diluted form of shamanism, and I don't see any difference between what a priest or a religious, sort of cleric or practitioner would do. And shamanism for me is just basically the engaging with the other, whatever that other is, some otherness that can't be engaged with through language or through using a phone. You can't call the other from and sort of receiving some kind of information and then materializing that information and then communicating to everyone else, right? That's, for me, that's the essence of shamanism. Whatever the medium is, whether it's acoustic, whether it's through making art, whether it's like through healing or through discovering things or looking at particles or whatever. So, but the shaman embodies that in a very sort of grounded, earthly way, and deeply physical. Because this is the thing. So physics, if you talk to physicists, they always sort of, at CERN, for instance, they talk about how we're looking for we are and where we come from, how the universe works, and to answer all those questions. But actually, the reality is, the more they kind of dig deeper, the more it becomes more complicated. So you can grow this whole sort of tradition and practice, that you can call science or art around this thing, but the shaman is like the base of that, alchemy and just grounded with nature. So for me, like, there is no difference between technology and nature, actually. Everything is man, if it's man-made, let's say, it's made by naturally occurring things. So it's kind of, we're just taking things from around and mixing them together. It's like saying, is a pancake natural or is it technological? Like you mix flour, milk, and eggs, and you get a pancake. You heat it up. It's alchemy. So that goes for anything for me.
I love how Haroon's work is made of connective, conductive, and reflecting elements: copper, mirrors, cables, speakers, solar panels, photovoltaic cells, coding, screens. Elements we hide in the walls, behind skirting boards, and the gaffer tape, the cables, the speakers, the little contraptions we know very little about, but which contain the basics of communication, and therefore translation beyond language. Ursula K. Le Guin wrote a brilliant text called Telling is Listening, where she compares intersubjectivity with amoeba sex. When amoebas don't simply divide, they sculpt their pseudopodia into a tiny tube and connect to each other, exchanging parts of their bodies. This continuity is, like Haroon's notion of shamanism, a physical property called entrainment. If you place two pendulums next to each other, she writes, they progressively attune to each other until they synchronize. That's entrainment. Quote, we vibrate. Amoeba or human, we pulse. We move rhythmically, change rhythmically. We keep time. You can see it in the amoeba under the microscope, vibrating in frequencies under the atomic, the molecular, the subcellular, and the cellular levels. That constant, delicate, complex throbbing is the process of life made visible. We huge, many-celled creatures have to coordinate millions of different oscillations, frequencies, and interactions among frequencies in our bodies and our environment. Most of the coordination is effected by synchronizing the pulses, by getting the beats into a master rhythm, by entrainment. And later, being in sync internally and with our environment makes life easy. Getting out of sync is always uncomfortable or disastrous. There is a bit of ableism, there is always a bit of dogma in theory, later in the text. Le Guin notes that autistic people are believed to have difficulty with entrainment, that they're out of sync. Adam, Eve, Others and a UFO contemplates the possibility of any source of molecular vibration or electromagnetic wave bringing their own rhythm. Le Guin here speaks for orality and for intersubjectivity almost against the book, which she claims loses a dimension of the story, a part of its aura. The book, that superpower of delay. She wrote that in the book, and I'm at my computer, recording my voice, thinking of dead authors, a living artist, an artistic experience, and you, listening. I'm doing what she calls second orality, communication in absentia. But doesn't communication implicitly point at distance, being out of sync? Otherwise, why would we communicate? If communication is accepting distance, parallax, and even meanderings of meaning, then translation is accepting defeat. It can even possibly celebrate it.
It felt quite important in the title to put in this word act, because it's an act. It's something that is a kind of a creative act, but also the in other worlds, which is obviously a pun on in other words. That translation also can maintain the untranslatable, the otherness of another language or another culture or whatever it might be. And otherness not in the sense of in a kind of negative sense, but what cannot be reduced to a dominant language, for example.
Isn't Eve a bad translation of Pandora, the perfect woman who released all evils or emotions, depends on the source, into the world by being too curious? That's what Natalie Haynes's book Pandora's Jar tells us. The relation between truth and belief is something that has been on Haroon's mind. Going back to a biblical management of power, pain and hope through belief in the 2013 peace was also picking up technology and its new role of establishing truth.
We were interested in sort of touching upon communication beyond language, like written or verbal language, much more linked to sort of established narratives, I guess, because it's much more linked to language itself. So written language and verbal language, but in terms of like news, let's say, news or history books. And when we think about wisdom, we think of something much that kind of passes on through generations, or we're thinking more about crafts, we're thinking more about like performance, like rituals, like it's much more hyper-local, I think, as well, much more communal.
The new work is a translation of Adam, Eve, Others and a UFO from its original form of coded electrical signals into a score for human voice and clapping, which reverses the relation of communication with technology. Translating here took on the characteristic of embodiment and presence, of the synchronization Le Guin mentioned, but also a deep understanding of communication as effort, care, attention. In Haroon's case, it was a question of collaboration, shattering the monolithic and symmetric notion of creation.
That turns out to a bar of 7. Are you happy with that to be notated as a bar of 7?
Yes, 2 beats, yes, okay.
Yeah, so that 5/4 part is now 7.
In these wordless translations, we lose something, but we'll also gain something. In his book, Is That a Fish in Your Ear?, David Bellows explains how at times one must choose sound over meaning, especially in poetry when translating. What is the priority in a deliciously rhythmic verse such as Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall? Meaning or rhythm? How can you translate these exact words into French? Bellow uses the example of a translation giving priority to sound and rhythm. Un petit d'un petit s'étonne Noël. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. In reality, this sentence means a small of a small is astonished at the owl, which is a place. Of course, practically, this is not helpful.
ChatGPT, Google Translate have given us, I think, the false impression that that there's a kind of answer to everything, that language can be easily and quickly translated, that any question you ask will give you an answer. And this kind of code model to language falsely tells us that like words are stable carriers of meaning, that language is just this kind of conduit for information, and communication is just it's just about decoding sort of these fixed units. And of course that is just so not what any form of communication is like. There's so many subtleties, so many things that remain untranslatable. We ask ChatGPT all these questions and then it gives us an answer very quickly and apparently seamlessly, but it requires like enormous resource which has like a profound impact on the environment. And I think we'd do well to remember that, you know, both the pleasure and the labor and the resource that goes into translation. Like translation makes demands on us. It demands us to think responsibly if we're doing it as humans and not as computers. Like we have to think in relation when we're translating. AI and Google Translate suggests that translation is just a matter of creating equivalence, and I think that's really dangerous because I think it flattens and simplifies what communication really is about.
You translate a buzz as a note and a click as a clap, such as Haroon did from his piece of 2013 into his piece of 2025. To translate one work into another, the first issue was to write the electric sound. What kind of notation to use?
Well, if I go back to the original work that this piece stems from, Adam, Eve, Others in a UFO, that was translating code, you know, to turn LEDs on and off into sound, you know, and that was like a simple thing. I just connected the, you know, speaker cables to the LEDs themselves, and you hear the electrical signals. But then translating that code, the program that drives those LEDs into a musical score was obviously a big part of this. A big part of, you know, that is a major sort of obvious translation. But there's also this thing of coding, decoding that comes into it. So originally I was going to translate the code, I was going to do it, you know, using, you know, computers basically. I was just going to do it sort of digitally, so translate the code into a MIDI file, right? So there's one thing. And then that was going to go to another software that converts it back into musical notation. But at that point, I, you know, got in touch with Sam. And so he, you know, brilliantly was able to do all of these things. And originally we were talking about the MIDI, but then he said, can I just see the code? And it was easier for him to translate the code, which is zeros, ones, twos, and threes. There was still some interpretation that had to be done because of technical reasons, how LEDs turn on and off and how you program them, and the variation between pulses and pulse width modulation, which is all technical stuff that we don't need to go into. Just going to say these random words now. That some audiences may know what I'm talking about and others not.
Obviously, musicians, sound artists struggle when it comes to translation, because how do you translate the translation of sound into understandable words for us non-musicians?
So there was two stages of translation, you know, literal translations that sort of took place. But then there's also some choice in terms of like what frequencies were used for this piece and why, and the sort of relating to the frequency range of the singers. You've got a bass, you've got tenor, alto, and soprano, two of each, and plus another soprano as a solo Juliet. Juliet Fraser, that is, and some new arrangements and things, but mostly it's quite faithful. Like the translation is quite quite faithful to the original.
At this point in the conversation, I wondered why there were 2 steps into the process of translation, and to what extent having technology involved in the sound making, sound noting, and sound editing didn't affect the relation to the message, as it were. Why not produce the notation from the sound?
This was basically what Sam's approach was. So I worked with another composer before, Shiva Fesharecki, who's an incredible young composer, and she transcribed one of these electrical signal pieces the way you're describing. She listened to it, pause, start, and just literally notated it. But Sam's process, he found it easier to do it like this, and it is very precise. There's some things that are different, the idiosyncrasies of the code itself, where you may hear a pulse, where you may not hear a pulse. So this is getting a bit technical, but you've basically got 4 numbers: 0, 1, 2, and 3, right? 0 is the LED is off. 3, the LED is on, and 1 and 2 are kind of, dim and a bit brighter, right? When the LEDs turn on, you hear a click. When the LED turns off, you hear a click. So if it's just going on, off, you hear click, 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 on, off, right? But with the 1s and 2s, they're turning on and off at such a high frequency, and this is this process called pulse width modulation, which is normally used to dim lighting, to brighten and dim LED lighting. But when that's happening, then you hear a buzz, you hear a buzzing sound, a tone, and you can do it at any frequency. So if you do it at 440 hertz, that's middle A on a piano, right? But in the code, he can just see 3s. So where he sees 3s, he might put a clap in, because that's what the 3s turned into. They turned into claps. But actually, if you see 0, 0, 3, and then 0 again, he might just put a clap in because he sees a 3, but it's turning on and off.
When we arrive, people are starting to gather in the side alley of the church. We take a seat, facing 8 music stands in a circle. I wonder how the Genesis, Adam and Eve, and the Old Testament will feature, and to what extent the voicings will hold their original version. I wonder if it will be perceived as an experimental and dry piece of music. After all, the work exists as the work for those who experience it, even if the work is often translated, as I'm doing now. Is ekphrasis the fate of any work of art? Ekphrasis is a vivid, epic description of a work in literary form, in words, itself also a translation, into what it seeks to detach itself from. Communication is, after all, relational, reciprocal, ideally, and often simply a perspective line searching for its vanishing point. From the crowd, a young man emerges and starts talking. At first it seems like the whole crowd is performing, or perhaps that a misguided spectator decided to cross the invisible threshold between listening and telling. The first utterance, spoken, looking beyond us, is,
"Open Deep Speak. Can you please recite the book of Genesis, but replace the concept of God with nature?"
The voice of the OpenAI chatbot answers agreeably.
Here is a reimagined version of the book of Genesis, blending scientific cosmology with a poetic
We've created
structure of
God
Genesis,
ourselves.
where God
We've
is
we've
replaced by
gone
nature
to that level
processes.
where it's like it's going to answer all our questions, and we're going to completely give in to this thing. So it's just an extreme outcome of what I feel like is happening right now. So in the performance, Canaan, whose name is...
Why did you choose Canaan particularly?
Canaan, because I was partly thinking about the Middle East, the land that Israel now occupies, Palestine. That region was at one point Canaan, pre-Judaism, or during that time. Noah's grandson. This is a sort of direct reference again to creation myths and the story of Babylon, which is present-day Iran, interestingly enough. But the character in the performance, he's a modern day. He's the only real person that's here and now. So in the beginning of the performance, he comes from the audience, and then he comes back to the audience, and so he's just the everyone else is on a different plane of reality, in a different dimension or a different universe or something, right? He's talking to DeepSeek. DeepSeek is clearly an AI, but he never acknowledges the personification of DeepSeek. DeepSeek, she really wants to be, there's a female voice and embodies a female, and they really want to be human. DeepSeek really wants to be human, but there's this bit where, and actually this was Noah, the person who played DeepSeek, said this herself. Maybe when I asked for Canaan, I'd say, Canaan, are you there? Because it's this kind of desperate kind of bid to be on the same plane, And of course, he doesn't respond to it. He's zoned out with these sort of seeds and patterns on the floor. And at that point, DeepSeek just leaves. The only real interaction with one universe and the other universe is DeepSeek hands the shaman
the bowl.
Yeah. And that's kind of an interaction, but they don't touch each other.
There has been an insistence on verbal communication as something fraught, broken almost. Rosie Braidotti sees it as a carrier of patriarchal and colonial thinking. Words. We have a duty of being nomads as writers and thinkers, she says, not taking words as gospel.
So DeepSeek, I just found it fascinating because it came out as a truly open source AI, and the way it kind of wiped out ChatGPT in a kind of a day. and I just found it sort of ideologically more interesting. I played around I sort of asked DeepSeek and ChatGPT the same questions for a while, seeing how they respond. It was like interviewing the pair of them, and I gave the job to DeepSeek because DeepSeek seemed to interview a lot better than ChatGPT. It was as simple as that. I think it might be just a personality thing. I'm not sure, but it is as simple as that. And I kind of liked. In fact, ChatGPT doesn't respond to these questions. When I last tried, basically, DeepSeek, when I asked the questions, I was in Japan at the time. I was on this island called Toishima, and I was preparing this project, and so I was asking these questions, and it was all fine, and it was working really well. I thought I'd ask ChatGPT the same questions to see, but ChatGPT wouldn't answer. ChatGPT would not recite the Book of Genesis with replacing God with nature, with the word nature.
Joking.
No, it wouldn't do it. I don't know why. Not that day anyway. It might have changed now, but that day it kind of refused. It sort of skirted around. It said things like, well, I can read the Book of Genesis for you. It's not necessarily to do with religion and God, but to do with faith. The amount of faith we as a culture are putting into algorithms, are putting into artificial intelligence. So like if I go outside, I don't drive anymore, but when I used to drive, I would just tap in the postcode into Google Maps, and Google Maps will tell you where to go, and you follow that blue line, right, until you get to even if that blue line is going a completely weird direction, you just trust it's going in that direction because there's traffic in the shortest route, right? It's not religious faith or a faith in God. It's like an extreme trust. It's like a blind trust. It's like or blind faith. I say faith in the sense that I have full faith in Google Maps that it will get me from A to B in the time that it's saying I will get there, and this is the quickest route because there's traffic on the other route, right? So it's kind of that kind of faith, right? So or trust. Let's say it's trust, right? What's the extreme end of that? It's like, we've created God ourselves. We've gone to that level where it's like it's going to answer all our questions, and we're going to completely give in to this thing. So it's just an extreme outcome of what I feel like is happening right now.
The singers walk to their music stands to read a notation with their vocal cords. The AI returns as a young woman carrying a bowl. Meanwhile, the young man is on the floor, first pensive, then squirming, and finally watching a young woman put seeds on a Chladni plate, which is a plate on top of a speaker marking its vibrations with nigella seeds. Book of John, chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Book of John, chapter 1, verse 14. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. Quran, chapter 2, verse 31 to 33. God taught Adam all the names of things. Then he showed them to the angels and said, "Tell me the names of these if you truly think you can." They said, "May you be glorified. We have knowledge only of what you have taught us. You have the knowledge to decide." In the first chapter of the Torah, called Bereshit, or the Genesis, it is said, "And God created humankind in the divine image, creating it in the image of God, creating them male and female. God blessed them, and God said to them, 'Be fertile and increase, fill the earth and master it, and rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and all the living things that creep on earth.'" Yet in the end, the question remains the same. What does it mean to be human? The Word was made flesh, the AI was made body. We created God, God was created in our image. God is the hinge of the relationship, the interface, the all-knowing entity with all the words without flesh. God created humans to rule over the biosphere, to procreate, to work and be fertile, and to worship him and his creation. When they misbehaved, he inundated the world, sent plagues to destroy the crops. It is not punishment, but self-fulfilling prophecy. William Burroughs recognized the sacred power of the written and printed word, mektub. He liked to quote the Arabic expression mektub. It is written, it is fated. Men have written the books, males, patriarchs, colonizers. We created AI, and AI is depleting the water resources and polluting the air. Quote, "Blinded by knowledge, we can often fail to see what is before our eyes. We attend to things only so far as it is necessary to accommodate them within the compartments of thought, so that they can be ticked off, accounted for, understood, laid to rest, but truly, to attend, is to bring things to presence, not to discover the truth about them, but to discover the truth that comes from them in the experience. This is the truth of wisdom. It lies not in objective fact, or in what scientists treat as data, nor will we come any closer to it by gathering more information, for the truth of wisdom lies beyond the facts." And this was Tim Ingold in a text brought to my attention by Haroon Mirza through Yates, Norton, and Inês Costa. It is called "On Not Knowing and Paying Attention, How to Walk in a Possible World," and funnily enough, you can find it on the internet. When I go back to see the exhibition, I stand in the room, absorbed. Something touches my neck. It's the first sound of Adam, Eve, others, and a UFO for Choral Octet. Just the clicks, the buzzes, turned into notes and claps. They fill the room. I move around, and each time I move, I hear it differently. Okay, so this was Art Travelogue, a journey to Southend-on-Sea, to Clifftown Centre, to Focal Point Gallery, to experience Haroon Mirza's new commission. It's there for you. It plays every 15 minutes as a sound piece at Focal Point Gallery. Thank you so much to Yates and Inês for all the chats, for the ideas, A special thanks to Emma Jeffries at Focal Point Gallery also for the documentation sent, because as you know, Exhibitionistas is an audio experience, but it can also be a visual one if you hop off to YouTube or Spotify. A very special thanks to Haroon Mirza for his patience, for his generosity and his trust. A final mention to the whole team that Haroon Mirza gathered. I highly recommend Googling Radical Essex, which is the project that Inês Costa referred to in the beginning of the episode, where you can learn a lot about the innovative and quite radical and pioneering projects that took place in the county, the most misunderstood county of the UK. I will put all the other references of the episode, and there are quite a few, in the newsletter, so sign up. You will always have more detailed references than in the show's notes, and in the show's notes I will give you a few pointers to what has been mentioned in the episode, of course, because there's really exciting stuff in there. But sign up for the newsletter, follow us on Instagram, tell us what you think about this new format, and until the next one, take care. Visit exhibitions, be present, and stay exhibitionista. Until next time. Bye bye.